All right, let's go ahead and get started. We will obviously be admitting more folks as we go on, but we want to go ahead and get started to be respectful of everyone's time. Good evening. My name is Josh Sherman. I am the Director of Community Relations for the Baltimore Jewish Council, and I just want to welcome you and thank you so much for joining How We Left, How We Arrived, a night of storytelling in anticipation of Pesach or Passover. I want to express gratitude to Rabbi Jessy, who is a partner in planning this and of Repair the World's Baltimore, and also want to thank Missy Smith, who is our facilitator for this evening, and of course, our 5 storytellers who you will be hearing from shortly. I just want to invite you all to engage with the stories tonight and to be an active listener. We would respectfully ask all of you to stay on mute. And at the end of the program, there will be time for Q&A, but we are going to do Q&A where I will be facilitating. And if you have questions, the chat should be open where you are able to message a host. So please feel free throughout the evening if a question arises that you would like to ask one or more of the storytellers, to go ahead and message the host the question, and that question may be asked at the end of the evening. So again, I just want to remind folks to stay on mute throughout this evening if possible. We're really, really excited for this event and for you all to hear these stories. I'm a firm believer in the power of narrative and in the power of storytelling. And I just want to thank all of you for being here. And I'm going to turn it now over to Rabbi Jessy to get us started with a little bit of grounding work.
Thank you, Josh and BJC, and also to all of the participants for tonight's program. In just a few days, many of us will come together spiritually, maybe not all physically, to celebrate Passover. Many of us are engaged in preparations of many kinds, most notably the likelihood that we are cleaning out our closets and poking into the corners to make sure we're physically prepared to encounter the spiritual gifts of the season. Tonight is about a preparation of a different kind. At the Seder, it is the commandment or sacred invitation of every person to see themselves as if personally they were liberated from slavery in Egypt. Avadim hayinu, we were slaves. And each one of us is to find ourselves in this narrative. This story is the birth of the Jewish people. Until our liberation from Egypt, the story presented in the Torah is a universal tale of humanity. However, when God liberates the Israelites from the oppressive systems and power of Pharaoh, with a mighty and outstretched arm, the particular story of what it means to be part of the Jewish people begins to be born. We cross over the sea to our freedom, and after a period of wandering, missteps, and the need to unlearn many things we had come to know, we receive the Torah, the gift of rules and instructions that serve as the foundation for how we are supposed to live as Jews in the world. We take on a new system that seeks to reject the ways of Pharaoh and to build a community worthy of God's blessing. I want to think about this invitation to see ourselves as if we personally were slaves and left Egypt. My friend Ari Feingold, a cisgender white Jewish male who grew up at a Jewish day school and in an observant Jewish community just up the road in Philadelphia, always starts his Seder with a lahavdil, a sort of established differential. Ari always begins the Seder saying, "I have no idea what it means to be a slave. And I find myself in deep tension every year when I invoke any possibility that I ever could. I have no idea, nor should I nurture myself to kid myself that I can imagine the experience of someone who has actually been enslaved. There is something harmful about pretending around something so serious that we cannot pretend we personally have experienced." Tonight, I want to ask us this question. What if we can't fully understand certain experiences of oppression, narrowness, limitation, and fear for one's physical and spiritual safety? And what if other members of our community can understand this from a different perspective than we can? And if there are other voices who can help us dig deeper into our foundation story as a Jewish people, how do we open up the space for them to share these stories? And what if sometimes we create experiences that reinforce the narrowness and limitation that we reject this season? In the spirit of storytelling, what are the questions that come up as we listen to truly hear? What do we understand this year that we've never considered before? And as my friend Greg would say, and why now? How can we encounter this year as a year where we are still bounded? And even if we are not, to see the ways in which our fellow Jews might be. And to look forward to the possibility that a year from now, we could be free or freer, or a few steps further along a journey in our lives, our families, and our communities than we are at this season, at this Pesach. At our Seders, how will we consider the story shared tonight about how to make sense of this invitation to see ourselves as if we have a role to play in the ongoing story that we tell and revisit every year at this time? What is our responsibility to work to address the narrow places and systems that still limit people from living out their fullness? Are we brave enough to link the stories that we tell around the Seder table to the stories of people's personal experience that are alive and well in our time? This is the Torah, the instructions that I hope can be the foundation for our evening together tonight. A night of storytelling, because we learn about ourselves and our tradition and one another through storytelling. And Passover reminds us the power of storytelling every single year that we arrive at this season. The story we tell at Passover should make us deeply uncomfortable if we consider the incremental pieces of the narrative we tell around our tables. The danger presented in Egypt when the Israelites were not free to worship their God. The hardship and the oppressive power abuse of Pharaoh, who made the Israelites work harder than they asked when they asked for permission to just take time to rest. The plagues brought upon all of Egypt that increased. And as I'm sure we have a new understanding this year, compounded one on top of the other, making it exponentially overwhelming to those who had to live through such uncertainty and fear. Tonight, you're going to hear stories by 5 committed, engaged, passionate, and courageous members of our Jewish community. Some of these stories may make you uncomfortable, maybe because you're surprised to hear of experiences you haven't had or you couldn't imagine happening. We ask that you take these stories with the same tenderness and respect from which they are being shared. These stories are part of an ongoing liberation narrative we tell as Jewish people, and we have different experiences based on how we come to this experience. They are the experiences that help us to identify where we are nourishing one another and where we still have the opportunity, the responsibility to work towards liberation in an ongoing way, especially inside our own communities. Like the story we will tell around the Seder table, these are stories that emerge along the arc of degradation and move in the direction of jubilation, along a path towards liberation. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being present, for listening and considering the questions that are being asked both explicitly and implicitly in the stories you are about to hear. And I will ask you this question at the end, but I will ask it at the end of these comments now. What do we want to commit to as individuals, as institutions, as a community, between this Pesach and Hashanah Haba, the year to come? We will not be able to do too much work in the 90 minutes we have together tonight. But between this Passover and the season of Passover to come, we have an annual invitation to think about the ways we want to build the worlds we live in from one year to the next. Thank you for joining us. And it is an honor to pass the microphone over to my friend, Missy Smith.
Thank you. Welcome and good evening. 100 years ago, W.E.B. Du Bois, one of my favorite Black storytellers, he lived and worked during one of the ugliest times in American history. He was an oratory master and the father of infographics. Has anyone ever seen a pie chart? That's him. Those data metrics and marketing tools that he used have become such an important part of the way we tell stories today in business and on social media. But he wrote his stories during the Nadir. The Nadir is an era in American history, post-Civil War, Reconstruction through Jim Crow 1920s. What is this place? For descendants of American slavery, it was the myth of Northern help to make sure the South followed the rules of losing a war. This was also an era when all those monuments that folks argue about dismantling were erected. People want their story to be the one that is told. They want to be the heroes, but we have to go back to the source. The Nader saw Black lynchings, laws in place that prevent progress, literal transient rules about where Black people could go in the middle of a great migration, even down to the hour of a day and the setting of the sun. There were blurred lines between lawmen and the lawless, and still a growing and thriving community of Black voices who would own the way we were being represented well into the 20th century. And sometimes they would pay their life for their pursuit of freedom and equality. So when Du Bois had an opportunity to tell the world about our Black lives in America, he made us human, which is a great burden to bear. He took his infographics in the 1900s, went back across the Atlantic, over the waters of the Middle Passage to share stories with an international audience in Paris. He showed them our families, our land, our schools, our business ownership. He even had infographics detailing the amount of furniture and what it costs to furnish a Black home. Because imagine being tasked with making sure you and all of your people look human to the rest of the world. Especially because up until now, it was never you who got to tell your own story. So anyone who knows history can also read between the lines of his artwork. Du Bois found the light to continue this unique storytelling and inquisition into this historical darkness. With his life's work, his call and his craft, he made Black pain beautiful. On the world stage, following the Nader, no one knew what would come in the next decades when Nazis came to power and unfortunately copied the blueprints for the ugliest parts of our Black American experience in ways the world would never imagine. So somewhere in the past thousands of years or longer, we have learned to classify and separate ourselves and to improperly assign value to those assumed categories. But what if we really and truly saw ourselves as a mixed multitude? Many of us should be ready now to walk alongside each other, always and forever towards justice. So tonight, we listen to stories from our kinfolk. Let our stories for Passover and our Seder table call us to action in our communities because we want to build. Our first storyteller, Sean, gives us a glimpse of what a story might sound like for a Black man who lived in America 100 years ago during the Nader. His great-grandfather has a story that will make you wonder, what would it cost to have your exodus? And what would you pay for your freedom?
Last year, I read for the first time the Pesach story from start to finish. The part about Moshe killing the guard reminded me of a story I heard from my family, which also led to an exodus for a lineage. The setting for my story is LaFleur County, Mississippi, a place that, much like Ms. Rahim, felt it prudent to enslave and oppress a specific demographic of the populace. LaFleur County in the Mississippi Delta encompasses cities like Itabena, Money, yes, the same Money where Emmett Till was lynched, and Greenwood, the place where Black Power was first uttered as a political statement by Kwame Ture. This county lynched the most Negroes out of any county in the state of Mississippi, which lynched the most African Americans in the nation. And as we know, America lynched the most people of color in the world. Now, just for reference, I said it like that to highlight the descriptive phrasing that has been used to justify different treatment. And while I know that this information was just setting the stage, I know y'all really came to hear how we left and ultimately how we arrived. Well, in 1921, my great-granddad was born to a formerly enslaved family who were at the time sharecropping and receiving unfair returns on their crops in Greenwood, Mississippi. By the time he had become a 25-year-old man, he had a wife and 4 children to look after. He stood about 5'8" at the time. He was dark brown and extremely stocky and outspoken. He had a love for music, particularly the blues. And most people, I'm sure, would also describe him as a charmer, and he had a strong sense of self. He and his oldest 3 children, my granny and her older brothers, would pick cotton at 25 cents per pound per bushel. Now, just for reference, a bushel of cotton weighs about 480 pounds. So the payment for each bale is about $120, and that's before tools and charges. Now, his normal production was about 4 bales or bushels a day. He once told me that the most they ever picked in a day was 5 bushels. That's almost 2,500 pounds of cotton. That's about 2 1/4 times as heavy as a grand piano. Can you imagine a man and his 3 small children picking that much cotton? and receiving pennies on the dollar and having come back every day to this unfairness in order to eat. The frightening part was that the farmer he picked for got $5 per pound per bushel for every bale that he sold to the factory, which is approximately $2,400. Now, if you just think, my family was not the only one picking on this land, which made it easy to create and maintain the wealth gap. My great-granddad was making ends meet by doing liquor deliveries for a local white farmer, as most young men from his area did. While this practice was illegal, it was allowed because it made lots of money. I mean, it is the system that built NASCAR and the Kennedys, but that's another story. In the city of Greenwood, there was a sheriff who wasn't too fond of Black folks, especially those who were seen as uppity because they had sense of self. Those are the ones he had it out for. Now, according to the story, if he had it out for you, you would be lynched. In fact, his role as law enforcement was to stop Black folks that he had it out for, create a reason for them to exit their vehicles, and once they would exit, he would arrest them, take them to jail, and members of the Ku Klux Klan would then retrieve the person or people and lynch them. One day, my great-granddad, his brother, got wind of a plot by the sheriff to lynch them. He packed up as much stuff as he could while my great-grandma got the children ready. He and his brother went on a delivery to make some travel money where they were encountered by the sheriff on their way back home. As the story goes, he employed his normal tactics of trying to create a reason for them to exit the vehicle. As they exited, the sheriff began to beat them and threaten them. After a few moments of struggle and what I would imagine is a situation similar to the one that Moshe faced when he watched the guard beating the Hebrews and decided to intervene, the sheriff lay dying by the hands of a man whose only desire was for people to live freely and unoppressed. In that moment, they knew it was imperative to leave the state. My great-granddad then returned to the house, grabbed his family, and drove to Chicago. Now, I know this situation affected him greatly because I did not hear the story from his mouth. And if you know me personally, you know he had great influence on my life, and he seemed to have told me everything. When he got back to Mississippi, he led the rest of our family north for better opportunity. They settled in states like Missouri, Ohio, and Illinois. Now, while he did not make it to the promised land of freedom of oppression, his love and compassion sustained several generations of people. And while I'm not making excuses for his action, the legacy of the great things that he did in his life are evidence that he did not want that situation to be his defining moment. So too is the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt. The loss and hurt along the way to liberation diminishes our joy. This is why we drop wine from our cup when we recite the plagues that came on Egypt. So too, we acknowledge the loss. We acknowledge how the loss is a lament, but also part of the liberation process. Now, I didn't grow up Jewish, but Baruch Hashem, my great-granddad made sure that I did grow up in a family that celebrated and based our spiritual responses on the actions of a rabbi with this same woolly hair and bronze-colored skin that I've been blessed with the opportunity to protect. The past year I spent on my Jewish journey, and I thought the descriptive phrase of color would be removed and I would just be a Jew. However, in Jewish spaces, it becomes my qualifier, and I'm then identified as a Jew of color. I guess I'm then qualified to receive different treatment where available, but I would pray that my family does not have to bear the same different treatment that this phrase has brought us previously in America. I mean, we do know that the founding fathers didn't mean Black folks when they said people. Does that suggest that the name Jew can only be used by those that identify as white? During the Pesach story, all of the people received Torah together in the wilderness. Generations later, David united the kingdoms, which made all the ancestors Jews. When the kingdom fell, they were all scattered to the four corners. They all remained Jews without descriptive adjectives to aid in their Jewishness. If we are all looking for love, acceptance, freedom of oppression, and the opportunity for our families and communities to thrive, we must stop segmenting people and realize that people are because God is. And if we radiate love as such, then we will honestly repair the world. Now you all know how my family left and ultimately how we arrived. And in the words of my great-granddad, I love you all and there's nothing you could do about it. This year, things were definitely different than last year. But next year, L'Shana Chabaha Be'Yerushalayim in real life. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Where there is comfort in captivity, there is liberation and freedom. How do we restrict ourselves with our own thoughts and avoidances, especially when it comes to the things we want the most? Are those big things or normal, everyday, regular asks. We might eat at the same table, whether for a daily meal or a large celebration. Shouldn't we always feast at a clean table to always be ready for a blessing and fellowship? Up next, we're going to listen to Tikvah's thoughts as she moves about the walls of her daily ponderings.
I was one of the ones who did not want to leave. I knew the travail in front of me would be difficult. I did not feel prepared. There was comfort in slavery. There is comfort in slavery. I feel this every time I do a deep cleanse. I begin to prepare. The kitchen is the heart of the mess, where things need to be shaken and stirred, where the soul is intertwined, and yet I avoid it. The thought of tackling it seems unbearable, even more than my story. Legacies, history, the gunk that has been there for years. I avoid it. It's too much. Instead, I move the couch. Although I know this is a distraction, I seek counsel. That's not necessary. Go to what matters. It's a distraction. I dust. I seek counsel. That is not necessary. Dirt is not chametz. Try again. I am worn already. I have not even started the journey to the heart of the matter, where it all happens and is made. I kvetch, I scream, I kick, I blame others, I sweat, I cry. I think I realize how trapped I am in this pattern of bondage. Who am I working for? What am I working for? I am holding on to these old behaviors, these idols. This is not my God. My God told me to leave it entirely behind. I am not ready. I sojourner still, feeling lost. This is not my choosing, yet I am chosen. I stand here and I feel that I have done so much toil. I see most of the work that I was patterned to do did not need to happen. Hashem provided, strengthened, sent guidance, and opened the sea for me to cross through, working to arrive whole and as me, without the additions of bondage defining me. I am not born out of slavery. I am born out of freedom. I do not have to prove or work for my identity. I am enough. I approach this holiday with this struggle every year. But something is beginning to change. The year my son joyfully in a store full of Jews sang Dainu, loud and proud, and the idea of enough resonated with me. Dainu speaks to the miracles Hashem did for the Jewish people, and in that moment also spoke to me about arriving in joy and freedom, to being enough, who I am in my skin, being free without the bondage of forced work, but choosing the chosenness. Being enough to be saved, to be free, to have my humanity. Of it being enough, not to have to prove I belong, but to arrive enough and not get distracted by dirt, being the chametz. but the soul, the kitchen, where it is all made. I can focus on that, which brings nutrients, love, connection, and let that be the source of my joy. The work and the joy is actually the discovery. Even up to the last minute at midnight, in the dark, with just a candle lighting the way. I left being attached to bondage of oppression, both externally and internally, and I arrived enough.
Thank you, Tikvah. When it is time to let go of our old ways and our old spaces, we may be called to take a journey. Another one of my favorite storytellers, Joseph Campbell, talks about the hero's journey. It's where we leave our comfort and we search and find people and meaning and purpose. If we're lucky, we survive the exploration. If we are further fortunate, we return to bring our wisdom back to our people. And more than teaching others, we're given a gift of finding ourselves again in familiar spaces with our new awareness. Here's Greg's story about his own pilgrimage.
Thank you. When we left Egypt, we were lost, broken, and disconnected. We were a people without a place to call home. I, in 1980, was born to a woman who too was broken, disconnected, and without a home. She would leave me after a few months to seek sustenance and drugs and alcohol. But she left me with someone who would, like Moses' mother, would bundle me up, place me in a basket, and send me up the River Nile, left to God's will. The river in this case would be the Baltimore City foster care system, where I would float along for nearly 3 years, unaware of life around me. For 3 years, after 3 years, I was found and I was adopted, where my new sister, Nicole, would help me find a voice, find a connection. And those of you who know me know that that voice sometimes doesn't stop. But that voice, that connection, would soon become quiet and disconnected again because of a feeling like I did not belong. Here I was, a brown boy in a brown family, going to a brown Roman Catholic church, where I would serve as an altar boy, go to Sunday school, participate in a youth bowling team. But like Moses, I did not feel like I belonged. I did not believe the teachings of the Catholic Church. I did not believe. But when I was going for the sacrament of confirmation, which is the Christian version of a bar mitzvah, I spoke my truth to the priest and I told him that I did not believe that the Savior had come yet. Too much is going on to prove that we had been saved at all. Yet, I was confirmed. And that confirmation led me to be disconnected and begin to question God and question my community. From grade school to well into my 30s, my Black and brown counterparts would tell me that I spoke, dressed, walked, acted white, that I was not Black enough, and that my experiences were not Black at all. How was this boy in brown skin not at home, not connected to his community of others that looked like him? I went on to wander the desert of life in search of answers. In high school, I began to ask my Jewish friends about why they were Jewish. Their response was simply, because I was born this way. They just were. There was no true understanding of why. So I went on and questioned again and questioned further. I would continue my journey looking for tradition, community, people who knew adversity, and a connection to something bigger than me, which led me to choosing Judaism, or Judaism choosing me. Even after choosing Judaism, though, I would be called a poser, a fraud. I would be paraded around like some sort of prize. Hey, look, I'm friends with a black Jew. Isn't that cool? Look at him. I was told on a certain Jewish dating site that I did not belong there. I was told that, hey, you'd make my grandmother turn over in her grave. This would be really fun. I was also told that I was trying to dilute the Jewish bloodline. Even on one Shabbat, I chose to order a cheese pizza that would be delivered to a Jewish teen center where I worked to help support Jewish teens on my weekends while I was in my 20s. Sacrifice. Teaching. I was told, though, that I was not Jewish enough. I was told that as a convert, that I was required to be more Jewish. For the first time in my life, I would not allow those people to deny me my connection. This moment, that was my Moses moment. That was the moment I saw Pharaoh's soldier kicking a Jew when they fell, trying to build the pyramids. My moment to do something. I would no longer accept anyone standing by, Jewish or other, kicking down other Jews. I would not stand by. I rose up. I would educate. I would support. I would challenge the authority and ask the question, what's a normal Jew anyway? I would lead Jewish youth groups to Israel. I would sit at the Shabbat table weekly, mark Rosh Chodesh, and participate in our annual traditions. Today, I wander after wandering the desert for years. The desert of life, like Moses, I would return to the people, having found connection, helping others find connection, helping others believe and repair the world. I would help others find the ability to be proud of that such connection, of a diverse people rooted in traditions that I pass along to my 3 Black, beautiful Jewish daughters that are just as connected to the Jewish identity as any lifelong Jewish bloodline. We left bondage in Egypt and America, lost, broken, disconnected, only to find connection by the mending effects of traditions that have linked a people for thousands of years. And during this season of Pesach, I asked the question, the 5th question, what is a Jew? What does a Jew look like anyway? Is there a norm? I thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Coming of age stories are fan favorites because we don't have the ability to go back in time and tell our younger selves what we would have done if, but we can learn when we look at ourselves all grown up, wherever we are in our timeline. With all that we know, there's still so much to learn from the younger generation. Can we be taught? Remember, the mixed multitude contained youth and elders. What might it have been like for a child coming of age during Moses' time? What might they have seen or told through their eyes, the ones that we hope to think of as we continue towards liberation? The future looks bright. Please welcome Piper.
I came to school for picture day in 2nd grade with my hair down and crazy, partly because I refused to let my mom do it, and also because I've always liked a crazier look. I liked being a cousin it, or as my dad used to say, like I stuck my finger in a light socket because it was fun and different. My mother tried to teach me, but we were both a little lost because I always had to be right, and she was still learning since she does not have black hair. I've grown to appreciate that she really tried to provide me with the hair background that I needed, and I liked being her tester when she experimented. But I was always Miss Independent, so I ended up with frizzy, dry, brittle, half-dead hair. I obviously noticed that my hair and skin color was different from my peers, but it was not a big deal to me until they started pointing it out. However, I liked a crazier look because it matched my personality more. On picture day, when I decided to wear my hair down, teachers started petting me as if I was an exotic animal, and my peers laughed at me. Wearing my hair down after that became extremely hard for me. People would ask what it looked like down years later or why I do not wear it down, and my response would be, "It is too much to handle," which was not true. I just refused to put myself through that again. Finally, in 8th grade, I conquered my biggest fear in a non-traditional way. For 1 month, I challenged myself to come to school with a different funky hairstyle every day because my thought process was, well, at least if they laugh, I'll be laughing with them. And while people did laugh, I realized who cares? And after that realization, I wore my hair down every day. People did laugh, but I refused to care because I could control my reaction to it even if I could not control the situation. And I went on with that mentality until I went to high school, where I attend Baltimore City College, a predominantly African-American school. Within the first minute of walking through the doors, I was complimented on my hair from both white and Black students. I then realized people love it or they'll hate it, but life goes on. I'm so grateful that I currently go to a school like City because I do not stand out for the way I look, but for my character. There are no preconceived notions and no lingering stares as I walk through the hallway. But the transition made me lose touch with a lot of things that were previously so important to me, such as learning Hebrew, leading Monday morning prayers, and studying Torah. While the light in me dimmed in that aspect, another one lit. I became friends with wonderful people, some being Jewish and others not, where we celebrate our differences and love that about each other. I learned how to take care of my hair, new words, and became part of a new community that I adore. I also found comfort in not fitting in and being different. I like that people like me for my genuine self instead of the conformative me. I still feel that way currently, but I had a pretty large setback in December of 2019. I went on a program where Jewish teen leaders were supposed to come together for positive change, but I feel as though I was left with lasting negative effects. About halfway through the trip to Israel, I was called the N-word, and later that day, a Snapchat group chat was sent around with racist memes, for example, cop cars are Uber for Black people. I could hear everyone laughing about the group chat, however, I was not included in it for obvious reasons. I then started crying in the back of the bus, which I found to be so embarrassing later that day, but looking back, it was definitely justified. My next step was then to take action, which meant talking to the chaperones, but no change occurred. I was later asked to explain to people my age who are supposed to be leaders why it is wrong to be racist and why they cannot say the N-word. I still do not understand how it is my responsibility to teach people in their late teens that saying these things is not okay. And after all of this, they were still not remorseful. They apologized because they did not want to get kicked out of the program, but that was about it. I accepted their apologies, but I haven't yet forgiven them. After this, I needed to try to build myself back up again, and I did that through therapy. I've come so far in just the year that I've been talking to my therapist, and I'm significantly healthier mentally. I went from being closed off and not willing to talk about anything to being able to share these stories with you today. My hair was still a large part of my life at this point. It was back up in buns and ponytails because I wanted to go unnoticed, and I did not want to be the subject of this kind of ridicule, especially from people that I had done programs with in the past and that share the same religion as me. Luckily, with the help of therapy, my hair is back down within a few months. My hair was left long, wild, and free until October of 2020 when I decided it was time to cut it off. My hair was no longer a symbol of freedom and happiness to me. It had become a burden. I was no longer the person who needed to have the biggest hair or personality in the room to feel acknowledged. I didn't need to be the center of attention to feel heard. And my hair reminded me of a time when I hated that my prayers went unanswered because I did not wake up in the morning to it being miraculously straight. I had found validation in other ways through giving back to the community, protesting, and raising money to donate to causes that I am passionate about. I also needed to relearn lessons that I was taught in the past about activism through white people. In 5th grade, after Freddie Gray's murder, all of us were taught that violence is never the answer. But as I have grown up, I have come to understand that it is not a white Jewish person's place to speak on behalf of the Black community just because they are Jewish. I've come to learn that in order to make change, you need to make noise, but that noise can sometimes be ugly cries of desperation. I believe Moses and I relate in that way, in which we both needed to relearn lessons that we are taught at a young age. He grew up believing he was an Egyptian prince, but in reality he was Jewish and called on by God to free the very people he was taught not to like. While no one I knew was ever taught to hate, they were not necessarily taught inclusivity and to celebrate our differences. Moses served as a leader for the Jewish people, and hopefully I've made a positive impact in someone's life who is going through something similar and struggling to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Moses and I both came to know that with the support of people and a little bit of courage, we could be ourselves. But what I found to be the most powerful thing of this whole experience was the same people who were laughing at my long hair were telling me how much they loved it when I cut it off and that I'm not the same person anymore, which was absolutely true. I had grown to the person who I knew I always had the potential to be, but was finally able to become just because I was able to let go of my hair.
Thank you, Piper. How and what do we teach the children? Some people, when they think of learning, they think of a classroom, a school, a building. Others think of the learners, humans inside, the students, and the richness of their individual and shared experiences, the fellowship of learning. How do we share our history? History is supposed to teach us to do better, maybe even unite us. In our present day, some of you may be familiar with the term decolonizing curriculum. Very briefly, it means, to remove white supremacy and Western bias from our history and replace it with a multicultural lens and analysis in the classroom. Do we also understand that each person has a unique understanding, a physical experience, and an interaction with these stories? And further, history isn't always millennia away. Sometimes it's a story passed down from generations not too long ago. Please welcome our final storyteller, Octavia.
Good evening. In my daughter's kindergarten class at a Baltimore Jewish day school, one of their Pesach activities was to make slave costumes out of pillowcases and have the kids march around singing, Avadim Hayenu, Ata B'nei Horim, we were slaves, now we're free. A prominent Jewish library program has a Passover activity on its website with a prompt that reads, you're a slave in Egypt, working and building all day with no time to rest. Show us what it's like. I can guarantee that no Jewish institution would have Jewish children dress up in striped pajamas and sing Holocaust remembrance songs. Our Jewish children are not asked to hide in closets and imagine themselves imprisoned in Nazi Germany, although children are often asked to pretend to be slaves and hiding and that they're going through the Underground Railroad. So why then are we comfortable asking our Jewish kids to dress up as slaves and pretend that they can identify with a life of servitude? If our Jewish institutions had more brown kids and staff, would they do these things? A few years ago, I was a guest at a wonderful Seder that included the singing of the Negro spiritual Go Down Moses. Later, I was asked how I felt about the inclusion of that song. I frankly think that singing that slave song at a Seder is weird. When I hear, go down Moses, way down in Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. What I hear is the anguish of my ancestors who lived in chattel slavery. Go Down Moses is a protest song, a song of rebellion. Enslaved people couldn't sing a song imploring their white masters to free them. The biblical imagery is really an allegory for the real pain, real toil, and real oppression that we can read about in the narratives and writings that enslaved African Americans have left us. Harriet Tubman even used this song to signal to enslaved people that she was in the area and would help if they wanted to escape. We Jews do not need to borrow Black pain to tell our own Jewish liberation story. I mean, frankly, the stories aren't the same. I doubt that there is a Jewish person who can trace their lineage to Egyptian slavery. Yet most African Americans that I know can trace theirs to the transatlantic slave trade. In Exodus, the entire Jewish nation with a mixed multitude was freed at once through miracles and went to a land that was promised to them to build a society in which they could live and govern themselves. We all know that the end of enslavement for African Americans was nothing like that. We didn't get to leave the land of our oppressors. Instead, we got Reconstruction, Jim Crow, lynchings, voter suppression, over-policing, and police brutality that plagues us even today. We Jews remember that our ancestors came out of Egypt each day during the daytime Shema, when we say, Ani Adonai Elohim asher ha-setzi etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim lechiyot lechem le'Elohim. Ani Adonai Elohechem. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I, the Lord, your God. In the Mishnah, Rabbi Gamliel commands us not just to remember, but to see ourselves as personally coming out of Egypt. I think that if each person at each Seder saw themselves as coming out of bondage, it would change us. It would change each person's proximity to past and modern day slavery. No Jew would be able to tolerate their children play acting as slaves. And things like cash bond and other inequalities in our criminal justice system would be untenable for every Jew. I see this emotional distance from bondage in the way that my Black Jewish child had to hear their classmates say nigger 44 times during the oral readings of To Kill a Mockingbird. When schools teach about the Holocaust, they use Elie Wiesel's Night. But when they teach racial discrimination against Blacks in the 1930s, they use a book written by a white woman from the perspective of a 7-year-old white girl. To be clear, no white person need ever say nigger to identify with Black pain. I feel the same emotional distance when I went to Target to buy an Okoye figure for my son from Black Panther, and I had to buy her in parts. Her torso, head, legs, and arms were in the boxes with different figures. There were clearly no Black employees at Hasbro who could say, what we're not going to do is sell a Black woman in parts. Sadly, the only time in my life when I felt overt racism was on my Birthright Israel trip. The same college-age Jews who talked about the rising anti-Semitism on college campuses in the 1990s, so this is 1999 during the Second Intifada, these same people walked up Masada with me and ate the amazing falafel in Tel Aviv, but when we got to the Dead Sea, they took the mineral mud, which most people do, covered their bodies and their faces, but they affected a Black dialect and exaggerated gesticulations. They put on a minstrel show. They saw me in pain and they laughed while I stood on the seashore and cried. Hashem chose Moshe, a Hebrew raised as an Egyptian prince, to be the Jews' liberator. I think Moshe's courage, his fight, his ability to lead a revolt came from his upbringing in a different culture with different experiences and expectations. Like Moshe, I think being both a part and an outsider is my Jewish superpower. As Jewish families become more multiracial and multi-hued, we Jews need to have our own reckoning with racism in our shuls and communities. For the people who know me, no matter what anyone else says or does, I show up, I take my place, and at times I take the lead in Jewish spaces. Every year at the Seder, The Magid begins with Halakman Anya, let all who are hungry come and eat. And if we do it right, all of our guests should leave our tables full, but hungry for more. Thank you.
Thank you, Octavia. I would like to thank all of our storytellers for sharing a piece of themselves this evening, and I'm just going to give them a jazz hands. Thank you so much. In my work, unearthing stories, I'm privileged to speak with many faith-filled spiritual communities, and I hear similar stories from our elders. They're tired of sharing their pain. They've endured through the struggle, the long arm of time, but more than discouraged, they are hopeful and thankful that people are still and forever in the movement. When I speak with them, I can't allow myself to be tired or frustrated because I have no idea what it's like to have their wisdom, their faith, or their sight. These stories come from us and are for all of us, as if we all left Egypt. As we enter Passover, I hope we will ground ourselves in faith and legacy proudly together. Thank you all for being a part of the program this evening. I'm going to pass the mic back to Josh, our moderator.
Thank you so much, Missy, and just a huge thank you and gratitude to our storytellers for working both with Jessy and I and Missy behind the scenes. And just I have immense gratitude for the work that Missy does and her ability to help our community members craft their stories. And in that spirit, we're going to do a little bit of a Q&A here. All of our speakers or storytellers from tonight should be spotlighted. So I will ask the first question, and why don't we actually start with Octavia, since you were the last to kind of share your story. We'll come to you first. So the question is, can you talk a bit about your creative process when thinking about sharing a story with 150 people or so? What did you think that you wanted to share and why? And yeah, just talk through a little bit about your creative process.
Okay, so when Rabbi Jessy first asked me to participate, everyone knows I initially thought, no, I'm not going to do it. But I thought Rabbi Jessy's kind of awesome and I can trust her because there's a lot of your person that goes into telling a story. And so you want to know that when you give a part of yourself to someone, to an audience, that they're going to receive the message with the intent that it was given. So I just, when we were talking about, she was saying, oh, we're going to do Passover and stories about Passover. And so I just started thinking about, there are so many things that could have been said. You know, I have amazing stories, so many different stories about the preparation, like Tikvah, about having Pesach at so many different people's houses over the years, as we've sort of, my husband's a Russian immigrant, came in 91, and neither one of us grew up with Jewish traditions in that way. So we sort of had to craft our own thing together by sort of like visiting people's, Seders, and then sort of taking the things that we love and, through research, all those things. And I just think it's, the last thing I'll say is I think it's hilarious that last week I was asked by the Jewish studies teacher at my kids' Jewish day school to lead the 2nd through 4th graders in activities for making Seders fun, as a person who didn't grow up doing them. But now I have this sort of reputation for like, we go crazy over here, man. It's like, it's wild, like full on costumes. And we have a red sea, but it's actually blue and everything. And so it's just really cool. I feel like, yeah, so it's just giving a part of yourself. It's trying to share something with someone that resonates. Because I think all of us, it's kind of universal stories in some ways. Like you maybe didn't have that particular experience, but everyone has had experience of feeling rejected, put on the spot, not treated fairly, not being included, and things like that. So Yeah, that's it.
Amazing. Would any of our other storytellers care to jump in and talk a little bit about your creative process? And feel free to kind of unmute yourself. We can keep it pretty informal.
I will talk a lot, but I also love talking about creativity. For me, it's a little bit of control that you get in a moment where you decide to sit down and make something, whether it's like baking bread, whether it's like Tikvah was talking about cleaning your space. Like you can feel very powerful in that moment. So I think for me, I sat with each of the storytellers and I told them all, I want you to operate from a space of joy and tell a story that makes you just like glow and light up. And we'll build the rest of this around that for each of you. So for me, it was really cool to have one-on-one conversations and just dig. Like Sean and I had an amazing conversation about the math involved in his story and, well, how big is a barrel of cotton and how much does it weigh and how much did he make again? Like, and just making things very concrete, to make sure that the story stood out. So I enjoyed every single person that I got to, everyone on the call. Like it was amazing to just vibe with them about these stories and also kind of look like, well, what are we going to do with this? And having conversations like that with the group was really cool. So I'll stop there.
Amazing. Do we want to hear maybe from one more of our storytellers?
To talk, but he just needs to unmute himself.
Oh.
No, we can't hear you.
Okay, there you go.
There you go.
I was like, you weren't giving me permission. I'm like, I promise I can be brief. I think for myself, I've been asked to share my Jewish journey for so long. My Jewish journey began, pretty much when I was like 13, and with the first Mr. Stahl, who was a cantor at Baltimore Hebrew, telling me that he will be my first denial of being able to convert to Judaism. But I think it was the sense of coming at it from this space where Rabbi Jessy and I were talking about, why now? Why is it now that there's this conversation about Jews of color? And it's like Jews of color have been around for so long. And while unwrapping my story with Missy, I got a little emotional because I realized that this idea of connection that the Jewish people have been embracing for thousands of years, I had been doing my entire life. And I realized that I had more of a connection to the Jewish story than I ever knew, even just 4 weeks ago. So it was coming from a place of unknowing. And I think when you tell a story that you don't really know yet, it means so much more.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. We'll move on to our next question. So through your stories, it is quite apparent that each of you are deeply committed to Jewish communal spaces. And you talk in many of your stories about painful experiences in your journey and within the Jewish community. But I'm wondering if some of you could talk about what sustains you within the Jewish community, and what are aspects of the community that you really lean on in times of struggle.
I'll let somebody else go since I've already spoken, but I want to tap in there. Tikvah?
Okay, I couldn't unmute. Thank you. I think for me, one of the, and I'll answer a little bit of the last question with answering this question. In writing my story, I recognized like I was actually pretty nervous to like deliver my work. And I've told my story. I've done different presentations but there was a way in which I was able to show up in this time that I haven't been able to show up, like Octavia was talking about, in such a personal way. And so, yes, like there is pain in my experience, but what I think keeps me grounded is that it is mine, right? Like in my piece talking about like, this is my God, like not having anybody run me away from my joy that belongs to me, my God that belongs to me, my rituals that belong to me, and understanding that like that's not theirs to take away. And so just that, like separate from the community experience, I think is what keeps me grounded in it. And being able to reaffirm that in spaces that allow me to do that. I get a lot of flack from like the synagogue that I belong to and community work and like being again in places that support me like tonight. But just it belongs to me, just like it belongs to any other Jew.
I think that something that's really important to me, even after all of the bad experiences and everything, is that all I knew was Judaism for 13 years. I went to a Jewish day school. All my friends were Jewish, and I didn't really understand that some of the things that people were saying and doing were wrong until I left. And even then, for every bad experience, there were a million good ones that could take its place, like my bat mitzvah and going to Israel. I went previously in 8th grade with all of my friends, and those are the types of experiences that stand out more than the negative ones.
Yeah, I would just say quickly. Oh, Sean, you go.
I'll tell you. Go ahead.
Now, I think just what Tikvah said, my mom used to have this phrase, one monkey don't stop no show. And it's literally like people can act in whatever way they want, but you control the show. And I used to have like imposter syndrome in the early days when, after my conversion and when I was 20. And I started to gobble everything up and I wanted to learn everything. And, I wanted to read Hebrew very well. And I wanted to learn how to daven. And I wanted to, all these things. I had to have the most kosher kitchen, because I didn't want anybody to think anything bad about me. I all of these different things. I didn't want people to think I didn't belong. But there at some point along the way, I just started not to care because it's my God, like Tikvah says. It's my tradition also. If every Jewish soul was at Sinai, I was there too. So there's nobody in this world who gets to tell me that I don't belong in a space that I go to. And so, last thing I'll say is like Zora Neale Hurston, who's a Black writer, she's famous for one of these quotes, and she says, "Sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it doesn't make me angry. It merely astonishes me. How can anyone deny themselves the pleasure of my company? It's beyond me." And that's basically where I am in my life, in my 40s at this point, is just like, it's pretty much your loss. But if I want to be here, I'm going to be here all day. And I actually probably will stay longer just to frustrate you.
So I grew up in one of the most segregated cities in the United States, Chicago, Illinois. And I didn't grow up in a traditional Jewish sense. I grew up as a regular Christian dude. When I left Christianity and I started on my Jewish journey, one of the first places I went was the Hebrew Israelites. And I know it was probably astonishing to some people who know me, but the reality is that was my intro to Judaism. Had I not heard the Shema that first day when I went to go visit these people, I would have not known the power of Hashem. And then coming into this community, right? I attend Bolton Street Synagogue. Shout out to BSS. And when I got there, it was nothing but community. the first day I got there, I believe me and Rabbi Jessy always talk about Bashert, right? So when I got there, the person who was speaking for the night was a rabbi from Chicago, Josh Weinberg, right? The first person I met there was Abe Wasserberger, right? My uncle Abe, and he had family, son in Chicago, right? I then met my uncle Gary, and he started telling me about his life, and he was showing me all of this love, and his wife, my auntie Deborah. So coming into that community, I understood that it was bigger than just me establishing myself as a Jew in the community, but more so about me finding my tribe and my family. And that is what I cling to when it comes to Judaism. I missed out on so much Judaism, right? I come every day, I got my CTs, I'm trying to normalize CTs, I got keypads with my name on them. I'm still the same Sean fashionable dude, but I live so much Jewishly, right? And I added Hashem into my fashion. And that love for Hashem, it comes through every day. And if people don't agree with that or they don't like that, that's not my cross to bear, you dig? But I love y'all still, and there's nothing y'all can do about it. So that part.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Sean. We're going to go on to another question that comes from one of the participants on the call. They said, I'd like to ask the speakers the following question. What can be done collectively to make Jewish educational books fully representative of the Jewish communities, specifically the Black and Jewish community? So, Greg, I see your hand. I will ask this on you.
All right. So, I think one way to make the Jewish, make the books a little more representative is just to make them look like the representation of the Jewish community. It literally is that simple. When you look at the percentages of Jews that are Black and brown, you know, there are Jews in Africa, there are Jews in India. Rachel has Jewish friends that are Indian. They're from India. You know, there are Jews that are Chinese, Japanese. So if you take a Benetton ad, you can make a Jewish book. It really doesn't. It's not hard. It's just simple. It's just make the people look like the world we live in today.
I know that there's this trend, interest, or whatever. You can see it actually in some of the notices and adverts that have come out from different Jewish institutions in Baltimore. There is a lot more, or there are a lot more, people of color. And I think like the PJ Library had what looked like an Asian Jew as their thing. And I know I've heard this actually from people before, is that if you don't have an Ashkenazic phenotype on something, how will people know that it's Jewish? If you pick up a pamphlet or a brochure for the JCC, but there are all these different faces on it, how will people know that it's Jewish? And and it's just like, I don't understand, because I have a Jewish family. We have Russian phenotypes. We have, my kids are sort of like Mexican chocolate colored, and, and then there's me, this dark-skinned Black woman. And so I just think that we need the authors. First of all, more of us need to write children's books. That's number one. And the second thing is, because I know Greg and we've talked about this before, where we have, over the years in the day schools that our kids have gone to, my kids have gone to 2 different day schools. And so I always buy a book that is, that has a Black child as the center of the book for the school for my child's birthday. Or if I'm invited to read to the class, it's always a book with a brown person or an Asian person or something, just not a white boy and a dog or a bear. And because there's so many out there, especially today. So I think it's easier to write things in the way that you see yourself. And if it's the way that you've always seen it done, it's easy. It's like inertia. You just continue to go in the direction that you're going. But I think that if our institutions actually, not just on special programs, not just during Black History Month, or a Pesach that has a slavery narrative. Invite Jewish people of color. And I don't really love that moniker because I am an African-American woman who is a Jew. But anyway, I think that if there were more brown Jews in these spaces, they would not be doing these things. That's all I'm saying, because it would be embarrassing, you know? Yeah.
Awesome. I think we'll have time for one more question and then we'll do a wrap up. So I'll ask this one question and get a few of our storytellers to weigh in. And the question is, if this season is a season of reflection on the ideas shared tonight through many of your stories, what are some of the hopes you have for ways we might move our communities forward between this Passover and the next? And then I'll see if there are hands. I think I have to unmute you.
I think Tikvah wants to go.
I'm gonna keep the theme of like tacking on to the last question and adding to the new. A good story is, I had conversations with my son's school about inclusivity around education material and making sure that that was happening. And it was time for Pesach, and he brought home this beautiful, like laminated, like C, right? And it was like it was with the paper plates, and you pull it apart and you see like the C split and the people. And it was, I remember just being in awe and in tears about how the people in the C were multicolored, multiracial. Here's the beautiful part. And they were tiny, like tiny little people, right? You could tell she had taken the time to color each one in by hand to make sure that it was a beautiful representation of what it should have been. And I think it's that. It's taking the time to make sure that we cover every detail and that we're accountable to every person and that we're doing the work without someone having to tell us, do the work, right? It's making sure that we take that effort when someone's looking, when someone's not. That's it.
I would love to chime in just briefly. I am, my wife is Jewish. I am faith-filled. And so I wanted to make sure the storytellers have space for this one. But as an educator, I think that, Tikvah, what you're saying really resonates for me. Like, there are humans inside these shuls and these churches and these schools and these organizations. And someone said it on one of the calls, like, it was a human who had someone ask if they could touch their hair. And so another simple thing that I ask is, if I told you that the way you were doing it now is hurting people, would you stop? That's a simple thing, and I'm just gonna leave it like that. So I think for the next year, I wanna hurt people less. That's one of my goals.
I would say, actually kind of related to both of those statements. Tikvah made me think of something that I learned in the Army, right? The Army's definition of integrity is doing what's right, even when nobody else is looking. Now that's really, 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 really difficult for a lot of people because we always get caught up we sometimes get caught up in our heads and we think to ourselves like, well, nobody's really paying attention to this small detail, so I can kind of skip this one thing. But when you are entering the rest of your life after today, right, just kind of take that into perspective, right? If I'm doing what I'm doing, will I be proud of myself? Like, if I saw myself doing this, would I be proud of myself, right? And if you can't say that you'd be proud filled with your attitude or the way that you proceeded in life, you probably should change a few things and make yourself proud, right? And it's that healthy fear. I often tell people that my idea, when people say you have to fear God, I think about it in the sense of like fearing your parents. It's not the fear that you're gonna get beat up or killed or something is going to happen to you. It's the fear of disappointment. If you don't ever want to disappoint Hashem, right? You understand how amazing that would be to live a life where you didn't disappoint the creator of your life. That would be amazing, right? So if you do things that you try your best to do what's right, even when nobody's paying attention to what you're doing, then you're probably on the right path, right?
Because I can't help myself. I just wanted to say one last thing. It's actually something that Missy said when our sort of like when we did a walkthrough or whatever, did a preview of this. So I'm gonna say it. I'm not usually a person who is like, white supremacy this and all that kinds of stuff like that, which is true, but I just usually am not. But one thing Missy said was, I think that if our shuls and our communities and our schools stop being white centered, like you start from the point that everything that you're doing is for a white audience. And so when you do that, you're not going to get the perspective of, and I don't pretend for that, you're supposed to pretend that you're someone else, but it's just like, if we had a delegation of other visitors in this classroom or in this school, what would they think about what we're doing right now? Because, and I say that, and I'll just give an example. My kid in kindergarten was taught about Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridge at a day school. Ruby Bridges is a story about a Black woman who integrates New Orleans public schools. So it's a story about one Black girl who goes into a classroom. She's hated. There are people outside with signs and all this kinds of stuff. So the teacher, who was amazing, had been teaching that lesson that way for like 20 years. But all of a sudden, you had one single Black girl in your class, but you didn't change how you taught that story. So what you did is you presented it as a Black girl integrating the class and all of these people hating her and how that is a very bad thing. So the other kids did not identify with Ruby Bridges in the way that my child did. And so my child came home with the question, do my classmates hate me? Because she had never felt anything bad at school, but it put this doubt in her head because she saw this discrimination. And that's why I feel like there's a challenge for schools when you only decide to do Black History Month for 1 week and you only decide to do 1 or 2 stories. What are you really teaching children? When you introduce the concept of discrimination and they're so little and you don't give them the ability to unpack it and figure it out and everything like that. So it took about a month or 2 for us to get our child right after that. And so I guess that's my thought. It's just like, to the people who come up to me who never met me and ask me for my Jewish story before they even know my first and last name. Do I come up to you and ask you? So I turn it back and they say like, what's your Jewish story? And I go, what's yours? Because it's weird. It's just basically don't treat others as sort of specimens or some other species. We are people who do, anybody who chooses Judaism does it very seriously. There are classes, there are requirements. I mean, especially if you are like observant in lots of ways, honey, it's literally through every aspect of your life you have to change. I can't even eat food at the family reunion. I'm giving up a lot, okay? So it's just like, I have proven myself to 3 rabbis already. I have gone through all of this. Leave me alone to worship and learn and study in peace. Leave me alone. That's all I'm asking. If I come to your shul, say hi, say Shabbat Shalom, and leave me alone. That's it. I'll do the same to you. Leave me alone.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Octavia. And a big thank you to all of our storytellers and to Missy. And I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Jessy to bring us home. We've got just a few minutes left. And I really want to thank all of you for staying on this call. And Rabbi Jessy.
Thank you, Josh, and really thank you to every one of you who accepted my invitation when I reached out to you personally and said, hey, will you tell this story? And we had at one point 150 people on this call, and the fact that we still have over 100 confirms my suspicion that they're not just stories to be told, but reflections and commentary to share after the fact. I want to say 3 quick things before we wrap up tonight. The first is I'm thinking about some of the comments that were made in this reflection time, and I was thinking about how I sit in shul every high holiday season, not the holiday that we were necessarily going to talk about tonight, and I'm always struck by the liturgy that says, for the transgressions between a person and God, only God can forgive, and for the transgressions between people and other people, only that person can forgive. And I'm thinking about that as it relates to this question of our own responsibility at an individual level and at a communal level. There are a lot of things that we do without much thought, and a lot of things that we do that we could put more thought into that may be tikkuns, may be pieces of repair that could help us to structurally and to personally and interpersonally start to think about the essence of that idea that we will hopefully return to together in person at the next high holiday season. That's number one. The second thing that I want to think about as we wrap up tonight is this idea of the Passover story being a story about leaving one system that was created with a disregard for the preciousness and divinity of every single human life. That was Pharaoh's system. Pharaoh's system was about keeping a very small amount of concentrated power amongst those and making expendable everybody who would help to create that system in perpetuity. And that God's decision to free the Israelites from Egypt only to create a new system was a system that was built to be a rejection to that system that was under Pharaoh. And so we think about the communities that we build and we think about the structures that we build, and we all want to do the menschy thing because we're all good Jews. We have to ask ourselves, are we building the systems that uplift the preciousness of every single human being? And are we thinking about that tent that's open on all sides where people can walk in and they can see themselves together? Because, and I'll add this just as an addendum to this second thought, people wandering the desert for 40 years in ancient Israel and Egypt, they didn't have light white skin. I pretty much am positive about that, which I think is just something to think about as well. The last thing I will say is you have all chosen to be here tonight. You have all chosen to take this open-ended invitation that when we say Hashana Haba B'Yerushalayim, in the year to come, in the cities of peace, Ir HaShalom, a city of peace, what do we each do as we take our steps and we wander and we hopefully receive revelation, which we know as Jews means making concrete commitments to be part of an unfolding story, so that when we come together this time next year to share stories, we're in a different place. And when Greg's daughter shares a story in 10 years at this annual gathering, her story is a different story than the stories we share tonight. We have placed a Haggadah insert into the chat, which I hope will also email out to everyone who registered. We put together a text sheet that you could just print out. You can bring to your Seder table. We populated that text sheet with excerpts from the stories you heard tonight and the questions that my community members and friends have asked of us to think about. And we invite you to continue joining us. And thank you for being here tonight. Chag Sameach, wishing everybody a meaningful and purposeful holiday season.